She walked into the hotel lobby with pride, her name etched in gold on the very building she owned. But instead of respect, she was met with cold stares and a bitter laugh from behind the counter. "We don't have a room for you," they said, dismissing her as if she were invisible. They didn't know the truth. They didn't think she built this place from nothing. In that moment, humiliation burned hotter than rage. But in just minutes, the power dynamic would flip. The question is, how far can prejudice blind people even when standing face to face with the very woman who holds their future in her hands? Before she ever signed a contract or shook hands with investors, Amara's life was shaped by grit and survival. She grew up in a neighborhood where ambition felt like a fragile candle, constantly threatened by the winds of poverty. The sidewalks were cracked, the houses tired, the schools underfunded. Yet inside her small home, hope lived in her mother's voice. Her mother, Gloria, worked as a nurse's aide at a local clinic. The pay was modest, the hours long, and the work exhausting. She spent her days lifting patients twice her size, cleaning up after emergencies, and comforting strangers while her own body ached. Still, when she came home each night, she didn't complain. She would set down her bag, kick off her worn shoes, and smile at Amara as if to say, "We may be struggling, but we are not defeated." Amara carried that smile into everything she did. She was a quiet, observant child, one who listened more than she spoke. Books became her escape. While other kids played outside, she sat on her porch with borrowed library books, devouring stories about worlds beyond her neighborhood. She didn't just read them, she studied them. She wanted to understand how people built lives filled with freedom and dignity. School was her battleground and her sanctuary. She excelled in her classes, not because it came easily, but because she refused to accept failure as an option. When classmates teased her for trying too hard, she ignored them. She had seen her mother's sacrifices too closely to take education lightly. By the time she was a teenager, Amara was already juggling responsibility far beyond her years. She helped her younger siblings with homework, cooked dinner when her mother worked night shifts, and took part-time jobs, bagging groceries, babysitting, tutoring, anything that brought in a little extra money. The weight of survival sat on her shoulders, but she carried it with determination, and quietly, in her heart, a dream began to take shape. Amara wanted stability. She wanted ownership. She wanted something that no landlord, no boss, and no cruel twist of fate could take from her. She wanted to create a place that welcomed people with dignity, a place where no one would feel the sting of being unwanted. She didn't know it yet, but this dream, born from hardship, built on sacrifice, would one day become the very stage where her deepest humiliation and her greatest triumph would collide. Amara's teenage years flowed seamlessly into adulthood, but nothing about the transition was easy. When others left for college with scholarships or family savings, she went with little more than determination and a part-time job. She enrolled at a state university, paying tuition through grants, loans, and working endless hours. Her mornings started before sunrise. At 6, she clocked in at a diner, serving coffee to weary commuters, memorizing orders while her own stomach growled from skipping breakfast. By afternoon, she was in class, taking notes furiously, soaking in business lectures, refusing to let fatigue win. And when the campus emptied at night, she put on a new uniform and pushed a vacuum through office buildings, scrubbing floors until her hands ached. Sleep was rare, but so was surrender. Her classmates complained about the workload. Amara carried books to her night shifts and studied during breaks. Professors noticed her persistence. A few offered mentorships, impressed not just by her grades but by the intensity in her eyes. Yet even here, prejudice crept in. Group projects often left her isolated, with classmates underestimating her contributions. When internships were handed out, she was overlooked in favor of students with lighter skin and heavier connections. But Amara refused bitterness. She took every rejection letter and pinned it to her wall, not as defeat, but as fuel. Each no reminded her that her yes would come. Her first breakthrough wasn't glamorous. She scraped together savings, borrowed from friends, and opened a modest bed and breakfast on the edge of town. It had 4 rooms, peeling wallpaper, and a creaky staircase, but Amara treated it like a palace. She greeted guests with warmth, remembered their names, and personally folded sheets until they smelled of lavender. She brewed coffee at dawn, serving it with a smile that made travelers feel at home. Word spread. People returned, not because the place was luxurious, but because it carried something money couldn't buy: respect. Slowly, she built a reputation. What started as 4 rooms turned into steady bookings, then profits, then the attention of small investors. The leap from a bed and breakfast to her first full-scale hotel took years. More rejection. More banks are doubting her. More polite smiles that mask disbelief. But Amara was relentless. She revised her business plans, knocked on more doors, and kept pushing until one opened. And when she finally stood in the grand lobby of her own hotel, gleaming chandeliers above, polished marble beneath, she felt something more profound than pride. She felt vindication. The journey from cracked sidewalks to polished floors was proof that resilience could build empires. But success didn't erase prejudice. Even as she rose higher, the shadows of bias trailed her, waiting for the moment to remind her that in some eyes, no accomplishment was enough. Owning a hotel was never about luxury for Amara. It was about proof. Proof that the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, and the battles fought in silence had been worth it. Each morning before the city stirred awake, she sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and coffee, reviewing schedules, occupancy rates, and staff reports. Numbers gave her clarity, but walking the lobby gave her joy. She arrived quietly, never making a show of authority. Her heels clicked across the polished marble floors, echoing softly beneath chandeliers that shimmered like constellations. Guests often mistook her for a manager or concierge. They complimented her professionalism, her warmth, and her eye for detail, never suspecting she was the owner. Amara didn't correct them. Power, she believed, didn't need to be announced. It needed to be lived. Her leadership was simple but powerful. She knew her staff's birthdays, their children's names, and their struggles. When one housekeeper's husband fell ill, Amara arranged flexible shifts. When a receptionist wanted to pursue night classes, Amara adjusted schedules to make it possible. She believed a hotel was more than bricks and chandeliers. It was people. And if you cared for people, they cared for the place, but not everyone saw it that way. Some staff adored her, inspired by her story. Others, though polite, seemed unsettled. They followed instructions with stiff smiles, never quite meeting her eyes. In meetings, they sometimes looked past her, addressing suggestions to her male assistant instead. She brushed it off, telling herself respect would grow in time. Still, small cracks appeared. Guests occasionally asked, "Can I speak to the owner?" and were visibly surprised when she introduced herself. Some stammered apologies. Others looked doubtful, as though ownership didn't fit the image they had of her. She laughed it away, but deep down, the sting remained. Despite the whispers, the hotel flourished. Weddings were hosted beneath golden lights. Conferences filled the meeting halls, and families made memories within the walls she had built. Amara walked among it all with pride, often pausing to watch a child's laughter echo through the lobby or an elderly couple marvel at the view from the terrace. This was what she had dreamed of, a place where people felt welcome, where dignity was non-negotiable. Yet beneath the polished success, a quiet unease lingered. She noticed how quickly kindness could fade into coldness when people forgot who she was. She wondered how deep those biases ran and what it would take to bring them to the surface. She didn't know it yet, but the answer was coming. And when it did, it would not arrive gently. Success brought Amara pride, but it also sharpened her awareness. At first, the hotel felt like a dream fulfilled, a sanctuary built from her resilience. But as months passed, small cracks appeared, subtle, almost invisible at first, like hairline fractures in glass. It began with tone. Instructions she gave were acknowledged with polite nods, but the execution came late, sloppy, or half-hearted. If her male assistant repeated the same request, suddenly the work was done swiftly, without hesitation. In meetings, she noticed side glances exchanged between staff when she spoke. Nothing blatant, nothing she could confront directly, but enough to raise a question. Did they truly respect her, or merely tolerate her. She overheard things too. Whispers in the break room went silent the moment she stepped in. Jokes laced with laughter that carried just a little too long, just a little too sharp. Once, she caught a front desk employee imitating her walk, exaggerating her gestures for others' amusement. They hadn't noticed her standing behind them until silence fell like a curtain. The awkward apologies came quickly, but the sting of disrespect lingered. Guests occasionally revealed the same prejudice in subtler ways. Some expressed visible surprise when she introduced herself as the owner. A few even questioned her, asking, "But really, who owns this place?" Their disbelief was cloaked in awkward chuckles, but the message was clear. In their minds, ownership and her identity did not belong in the same sentence. Amara tried to brush it aside. She told herself that time and consistency would melt bias, that by showing grace she could disarm prejudice. After all, wasn't that what her mother had always done, meeting hardship with quiet endurance? She clung to that belief, even as her patience was tested. But something gnawed at her. Leadership, she realized, wasn't just about kindness. It also demanded accountability, and no amount of professionalism could completely erase bias when it was rooted deeper than manners. The respect she expected, the respect she had earned, wasn't universal. Her closest friends noticed her unease. They warned her, "Amara, not everyone will see you for who you are. Some will only see what they want to see." She nodded but remained hopeful. She believed that if she continued to invest in her staff and show them dignity, they would eventually return it. She didn't yet know that the moment of truth was coming. A moment when politeness would vanish, when prejudice would step boldly into the open, and when those quiet cracks would shatter into something undeniable. The day everything changed began like any other. The hotel breathed with its usual rhythm, suitcases rolling across polished floors, the soft murmur of travelers checking in, and the faint melody of jazz drifting from hidden speakers. To a casual observer, it was just another day in paradise, a portrait of elegance and order. For Amara, it was supposed to be routine. She had just returned from a business trip, tired but excited to see her creation again. Instead of announcing her arrival or calling ahead, she decided to walk in quietly, blending in as any other guest. She wanted to experience the hotel from the outside in, to feel what a stranger might feel stepping into her lobby. It was something she did occasionally, a way to ensure the service matched her vision. She carried a modest suitcase, wore a simple dress, and left behind the air of ownership. No assistants, no staff by her side, just a woman with a reservation in mind. She moved through the lobby, absorbing the details, the flicker of candles at the reception desk, the polite hum of conversations, the faint smell of fresh flowers near the elevators. Everything appeared perfect, at least on the surface. Approaching the front desk, she noticed the receptionist glance at her with a flicker of hesitation. It was small, barely a pause, but Amara had learned to read those pauses. They were often the first signs that something deeper was at play. She offered a polite smile, expecting the same in return. Instead, she was met with an expression she couldn't quite name. Dismissive, almost mocking. "Good evening," she began softly. "I'd like a room, please." The receptionist's smile was thin, strained. Fingers tapped the keyboard in a performance rather than a necessity. Then came the words Amara hadn't expected, words so casual they almost slipped past unnoticed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're fully booked." Her eyes flicked to the computer screen. She knew the truth. She had seen the occupancy numbers herself. Half the rooms were available, but she stayed silent, her heart slowing into a heavy thud. She waited for clarification, an explanation, anything. Instead, the receptionist avoided her gaze, shuffling papers as though the conversation was already over. Amara stood still, her pride intact but her dignity under siege. This wasn't just a denial, it was a dismissal. And as she turned her head, she caught the faintest smirk exchanged between two staff members nearby. Something inside her shifted. What began as a simple, ordinary evening was unraveling into something darker. A storm was gathering, and within minutes, the lobby would no longer be a place of comfort. but a stage where masks would fall and truths would burn through the silence. The words, "We're fully booked," echoed louder than they should have. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the tone, flat, dismissive, almost rehearsed. Amara stood motionless for a second, her fingers tightening on the handle of her suitcase. She knew the numbers. This was her hotel, her investment, her dream. Half the rooms were empty. Suites were waiting, beds turned down, lights glowing behind unclaimed doors. The receptionist's lie wasn't clumsy. It was deliberate. Still, she chose restraint. She tilted her head politely, her voice calm. "Are you certain? I only need one night. Perhaps a standard room?" The receptionist didn't check again. Didn't even glance at the screen properly. Instead, she sighed, eyes flicking up with faint irritation, as though Amara's persistence was a nuisance. "As I said, ma'am, we're completely booked." Something inside her twisted. Not anger yet. More like disbelief, that strange numbness when reality refuses to make sense. She stepped aside, allowing another guest to approach the desk. That was when the contrast became impossible to ignore. A middle-aged white man in a suit rolled his luggage forward, asking for a room without a reservation. The same receptionist who had just turned Amara away lit up with practiced warmth. Fingers flew across the keyboard, smile widening as though she had been waiting all evening for this moment. "Of course, sir," she said sweetly. "We have several options available for you." Amara's stomach dropped. The words stung, sharper than any insult. She watched as a key card was slid across the counter, papers signed, and pleasantries exchanged. It took less than 3 minutes. The man left smiling, rolling his suitcase toward the elevators. Amara's pulse quickened. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't imagining. She had been denied what was freely offered to someone else, someone whose only difference was the color of his skin. She glanced around the lobby. No one else seemed to notice, or perhaps no one cared. The staff moved briskly behind the counter, avoiding her gaze, pretending she no longer existed. Her chest tightened. This was more than a denial. It was a message. A quiet declaration that she didn't belong in the space she had built, a space she owned. The realization hit her harder than the words themselves. She was being erased. Piece by piece, from her own creation. Amara didn't move from the spot. Her suitcase rested by her side, but her feet felt anchored to the marble floor. A part of her still waited for the receptionist to correct herself, to laugh lightly and admit a mistake. But no such correction came. The staff went on with their tasks, deliberate in their avoidance. She decided to linger, pretending to scroll through her phone, but her eyes stayed fixed on the desk. Within minutes, a young white couple walked up. Their clothes were travel-wrinkled, their voices tired, but they were greeted with smiles that stretched wide and warm. "Welcome," the receptionist chirped. "We'd be delighted to find you a room." Amara's stomach knotted. She caught every detail, the friendly tilt of the receptionist's head, the lightness in her tone, the easy willingness to accommodate. Keys were handed over, laughter exchanged. The couple left, their exhaustion replaced by relief. Their exhaustion replaced by relief. It was undeniable now. Rooms weren't scarce. Hospitality wasn't scarce. Courtesy wasn't scarce. It was only being rationed, selectively. As Amara observed, she noticed other staff glancing at her from time to time, not with curiosity, but with something colder. There was a stiffness in their posture, an unspoken agreement in the way they turned their attention elsewhere when her eyes met theirs. She was present in the room, but treated as if invisible, like a shadow that didn't deserve acknowledgement. A bellboy wheeled past with a luggage cart, slowing as he noticed her suitcase unattended. For a moment their eyes met. His expression flickered, not neutral, not kind. It was a look she knew well from childhood, suspicion. The unspoken question lingered in his gaze. "What are you doing here?" Amara inhaled deeply, her chest heavy with both disbelief and familiarity. This wasn't new. She had faced prejudice before, subtle exclusions in boardrooms, dismissive tones in business negotiations, the occasional security guard trailing her through upscale stores. But here? Here, in a building she had poured her heart and wealth into? That was different. This wasn't just racism. It was betrayal. Minutes ticked by. More guests checked in. Each interaction was like salt rubbed deeper into a wound. The smiles, the welcoming gestures, the eagerness to please, they were displayed freely, but never for her. And with each denial of acknowledgement, her silence grew heavier, sharper. The longer she stood unnoticed, the more she realized this wasn't an accident. It was a performance, carefully maintained, meant to remind her of where they believed she belonged and where they thought she did not. Her fingers curled into fists. Something inside her was starting to shift. The patience she had carried into the lobby was thinning, thread by thread. Amara finally stepped forward again, her suitcase wheels scraping softly against the marble floor. Her patience had limits, and tonight it was unraveling. She placed her hand lightly on the counter, her voice even but edged with steel. "Excuse me," she said, locking eyes with the receptionist. "I couldn't help but notice you've been checking in other guests. Could you double-check your availability for me?" The receptionist's smile vanished instantly. Her jaw stiffened. Her fingers froze on the keyboard. For a beat too long, she didn't answer. When she finally did, her tone was sharper, clipped. "As I said, ma'am, we are fully booked." The words were repeated like a shield, as though repetition could disguise the lie. Amara leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice, not out of fear but in quiet defiance. "I'm familiar with the occupancy rate tonight. I know there are rooms available." A ripple of unease passed over the receptionist's face. For a second, her mask slipped, but only for a second. Then came the scoff, the narrowing of her eyes, the practiced indifference. "I don't know where you're getting your information, but I can assure you there are no rooms." Her words carried something heavier now, an undercurrent of irritation that was impossible to ignore. And as she spoke, another staff member drifted closer, standing just within earshot. His arms folded across his chest, posture stiff, protective, not of her, but of the lie. Amara felt the eyes of the lobby shifting toward her. A few guests had noticed, their glances curious, some sympathetic, others amused. She wasn't causing a scene yet, but the tension was thick enough to draw attention. She swallowed her pride, steadying herself. "I'm simply asking for fairness," she said softly. The second staff member chuckled under his breath, the sound deliberate. The receptionist's lips twitched with the shadow of a smirk, though she quickly disguised it. The message was clear. They weren't just denying her. They were enjoying it. Heat rose in Amara's chest, her pulse thundering in her ears. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a clerical error. It was rejection delivered with a kind of quiet cruelty, a dismissal laced with prejudice, wrapped in false professionalism. For the first time, Amara let silence stretch between them. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. The receptionist fidgeted slightly, tapping a pen against the desk. But she didn't yield. The air in the lobby grew heavier, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Amara's dignity was being tested, and she knew this was no longer about a room. It was about principle. The lobby felt colder now, though the air conditioning hadn't changed. It wasn't the temperature, it was the atmosphere. Amara could feel it pressing down on her, heavy with judgment, as if the very walls had joined in the conspiracy to erase her. The receptionist returned to her computer, pretending to type, her eyes sliding past Amara as if she weren't there. The second staff member still lingered, arms folded, gaze fixed on her like a silent warning. Around them, the lobby moved on, tourists snapping photos of the chandelier, children giggling near the fountain, but in Amara's corner, time slowed. And then came the whispers. From behind the counter, two employees leaned toward each other, speaking in tones too soft to catch, but their eyes flicked in her direction. One chuckled, quickly covering it with a cough when Amara's gaze cut toward them. Another walked by, shooting her a look that wasn't openly hostile, but dismissive, as though she were out of place, in her own hotel. Her hands curled tighter around the suitcase handle. She tried to unclench her jaw, but the tension sat heavy there, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Every smirk, every whispered word, every glance that slid over her like she was invisible, stoked the fire burning in her chest. Nearby, another guest had begun to watch. A woman, also white, raised an eyebrow at the interaction, her expression unreadable. Was it curiosity, pity, or worse, a quiet agreement with the staff's behavior? The uncertainty only deepened Amara's isolation. The final spark came when a new guest, a young white woman with a bright scarf, approached the desk. She didn't have a reservation either, but unlike Amara, she was met with enthusiastic assistance. The receptionist's smile returned in full bloom, her voice suddenly sweet again. "Of course, ma'am. Let me check what's available." Amara's chest tightened. Available. The word cut deep, slicing through the web of lies. Available, but not for her. The young woman received a key card in minutes, walking away blissfully unaware of the silent war being fought behind her. For Amara, something snapped. Not outwardly, she didn't shout, didn't throw accusations. But inside, the dam broke. The humiliation had seeped past her defenses, coiling into rage. Rage not just for herself, but for every time someone who looked like her had been told they didn't belong. Her silence was no longer passive. It was loaded, deliberate, and dangerous. The storm inside her had reached its boiling point, and she knew with chilling certainty that she would not leave this lobby defeated. Amara stood rooted in place, her silence louder than the lobby's chatter. Her eyes trailed the young woman with the key card, disappearing into the elevator with a satisfied smile. The receptionist, now free of her brief charade of courtesy, exhaled and turned away, clearly convinced the matter was closed. But for Amara, nothing was closed. Her chest rose and fell slowly, as though each breath was an anchor holding back the tidal wave inside her. For years, she had mastered the art of composure, smiling when dismissed, nodding politely when underestimated, working twice as hard to prove what should have never been questioned. But tonight, in this place, those defenses felt like chains. Her gaze swept the lobby. The grand chandelier above shimmered, scattering light across marble floors. She remembered the day she had chosen it, insisting on a design that symbolized both beauty and strength. She remembered the countless nights spent sketching layouts, approving fabric swatches, negotiating contracts, and making sure every detail carried her vision. This wasn't just a hotel. It was her name, her identity, her legacy carved into stone and glass. And here she was, denied entry, erased, mocked, inside her own creation. The injustice scorched her veins. It wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. If she walked away quietly now, what message would that send? That she could be silenced? That she could be erased from what she had built with her own hands? No. Her fingers loosened on the suitcase handle, then tightened again, not in resignation, but in resolve. A calm, eerie resolve that felt more powerful than anger. Her heartbeat slowed, no longer frantic, but steady, deliberate. She knew exactly what needed to be done. The staff might have thought they had won, that they had reminded her of her place. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated who she was. She turned her gaze back to the counter. The receptionist still avoided eye contact, busying herself with meaningless tasks, unaware that the ground beneath her was already shifting. Amara's lips curved, not in a smile, but in something far sharper, the quiet expression of a woman who had been pushed too far. The storm had broken. What came next would not be an argument. It would not be a plea. It would not even be a confrontation. It would be justice, swift, final, unforgettable. And when it arrived, the same walls that had witnessed her humiliation would echo with a lesson none of them would ever forget. Echo with a lesson none of them would ever forget. The silence that hung between Amara and the staff was no longer passive. It was electric, charged with the weight of something inevitable. The receptionist typed aimlessly on her keyboard, pretending to be busy, while the second staff member still hovered nearby with folded arms, his smirk growing bolder by the second. Amara finally stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor with measured precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was more unsettling than anger could ever be. "I'll ask you one last time," she said evenly, her eyes fixed on the receptionist. "Are there rooms available tonight?" The receptionist glanced up, startled by the tone. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't desperate. It was sharp, steady, undeniable. Still, she clung to the lie. "As I've told you, ma'am, we are fully booked." The words echoed through the lobby, thin and hollow. This time, others heard it clearly. Guests seated nearby raised their heads. A man waiting for his taxi leaned in. Even the bellboy slowed his steps, curiosity pulling him closer. Amara didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to draw the receptionist's full attention. "You're certain?" The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twitching against the desk. She nodded stiffly. "Yes, we are full." Amara straightened, her expression unreadable. She let the silence expand, filling the space between them until the weight of it pressed against every corner of the lobby. For a moment it seemed she might turn and walk away, suitcase in hand, dignity intact but bruised. But then she placed the suitcase gently beside her, folded her hands on the counter and smiled, a smile so calm it chilled the room. "Interesting," she said softly, "because I know for a fact this hotel is running at just under 50% capacity tonight." A ripple passed through the air. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. The receptionist's face paled, her smirk faltering. It wasn't anger that made the moment powerful. It was certainty. A quiet certainty that told everyone watching, this woman knew something no one else did. The performance was over. The stage was set, and for the first time that evening, the staff realized they were no longer in control. The receptionist's face drained of color. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard as if frozen mid-air, and for the first time that evening, her mask of confidence cracked. The second staff member straightened, no longer smirking, his arms falling awkwardly to his sides. Amara's voice was calm but unyielding. "You say there are no rooms available? And yet I have just watched you check in 3 different guests, none of whom had reservations." She paused, letting the words sink in. Around her, the murmur of the lobby died into complete silence. Every ear strained toward her. The receptionist opened her mouth, fumbling for an excuse. I was following—" Amara cut her off with a single raised hand. "No, you were not following policy. You were following prejudice." The words landed like thunder. Guests shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, as though watching a play they hadn't expected to unfold. Amara drew herself up to her full height. Her calm, commanding tone carried across the room with ease. "Perhaps you should know who you've been speaking to this entire time." The receptionist blinked, confusion spreading across her face. I don't understand." "You will," Amara said, her gaze unwavering. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a sleek leather folder, and laid it on the counter with quiet finality. The company's crest glimmered in gold against the cover. She opened it slowly, deliberately, revealing documents that bore her name, contracts, deeds, ownership. "My name is Amara Johnson," she said, her voice steady, resonant. "And this is my hotel." The air snapped with collective shock. Gasps rippled through the lobby. The bellboy's cartwheels screeched as he stopped in his tracks. Guests exchanged astonished looks, some covering their mouths in disbelief. The receptionist staggered back a step, her mouth hanging open. Her earlier arrogance evaporated, replaced with stammering desperation. I didn't know. I didn't realize—" Amara's eyes hardened. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with dignity. That is the problem." The second staff member, once smug, now looked like a child caught in the act. His folded arms hung limp, his eyes darting toward the exit as though escape were possible. But there was no escape. Not tonight. In a single, devastating moment, the power had shifted. The staff who had mocked her stood exposed, stripped of their authority, their hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. The predator had become the prey. For several long seconds, the entire lobby seemed suspended in silence. The air felt heavy, as though even the walls of the hotel were listening. Then, slowly, the sound of whispered voices began to rise, cautious at first, then swelling into a low current of disbelief. "Did she say owner?" one guest murmured, clutching her husband's arm. "That's her name on the deed," Another whispered, eyes fixed on the folder displayed like a crown jewel on the counter. Crown jewel on the counter. The receptionist's lips moved soundlessly, still searching for words that would not come. Her once confident smile had collapsed, leaving only a pale mask of dread. The second staff member tried to speak, but faltered under the weight of the stares now piercing through him from every direction. Amara, however, did not waver. She let the silence stretch, allowed the weight of the moment to bear down on those who had wronged her. Then she spoke again, her tone firm but quiet, every syllable sharp as glass. "You mocked me. You denied me. Not because this hotel had no rooms." She glanced toward the open ledger still glowing on the receptionist's screen, clear evidence of availability. "But because of who I am. Because of the color of my skin." The whispering swelled, outrage sparking among the guests. Some shook their heads, disgust written plainly on their faces. One man muttered, "Unbelievable! In this day and age?" Another guest pulled out his phone, subtly recording the scene. The staff noticed, and panic flickered in their eyes. Their arrogance had not just shattered. It had been witnessed, captured. There would be no burying it. The receptionist's knees wobbled as she leaned on the counter for support. "Ms. Johnson, I never meant—" "Stop," Amara said coldly. "This is not the time for excuses." Her gaze swept across the lobby, meeting the eyes of strangers who now looked at her with respect, even admiration. The very people who had watched her humiliation only minutes earlier were now witnesses to her strength, and to the shame of those who had belittled her. The power in the room had shifted completely. What was once a private insult had become a public reckoning, and for the staff, there was no going back. The silence stretched again, but this time it was not heavy with confusion. It pulsed with anticipation. Every person in the lobby seemed to lean forward, waiting to hear what Amara would say next. The staff who once sneered at her now stood frozen, stripped of their arrogance, their futures dangling on the edge of her decision. Amara let them sweat. She wanted them to feel the weight of every second, to taste the fear they had so easily served her when they denied her dignity. Finally, she drew in a breath, straightened her shoulders, and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had carried both pain and power. "This hotel was built to be a place of welcome," she said, her voice ringing through the lobby. "But today, the very people entrusted to uphold that vision have poisoned it with prejudice. You did not just turn me away, you turned away every value this place was meant to stand for." Her words cut like a blade. The receptionist's lip trembled, and the other staff member clasped his hands together as though in prayer. "Please, Ms. Johnson," he stammered, his voice breaking. We didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Amara snapped, her voice rising now, commanding the entire room. "You laughed. You mocked. You thought your cruelty would remain hidden. But look around." She gestured to the guests, phones raised, eyes burning with judgment. "The world sees you now." Gasps echoed through the room. The receptionist's face flushed crimson. Tears welled in her eyes, but Amara did not soften. "You are relieved of your duties. Effective immediately." The declaration rang like a gavel striking wood. The staff flinched as though struck. "No, please, we need this job," the receptionist begged, stepping forward. But Amara held up her hand, silencing her. "Jobs are earned through integrity, respect, and honor. You displayed none." The words reverberated off the marble walls, final and undeniable. Guests erupted in quiet applause, some nodding firmly, others murmuring words of support. What had begun as a private act of discrimination had transformed into a public act of justice. The staff slunk backward, pale and trembling, their power evaporated. They were no longer gatekeepers of her dignity. They were outcasts in the very place they had tried to dominate. Amara stood tall, unbroken, her presence radiating strength. The humiliation they inflicted on her had been reversed, and in its place stood a reckoning that none present would forget. For a long moment after her words echoed through the lobby, the silence lingered, deep, heavy, almost sacred. Then slowly the sound of hands meeting in applause rose from the far corner. A guest, an older woman with silver hair, clapped with steady resolve. Soon, another joined, then another, until the marble hall filled with the sound of recognition, not just for Amara's courage, but for the justice they had all just witnessed. The staff stood motionless, their uniforms suddenly meaningless, their authority stripped bare. Some guests shook their heads in disbelief, muttering under their breath about the audacity, the cruelty, the shame that had unfolded so publicly. The receptionist, red-faced and trembling, wiped furiously at her tears, while the second staff member avoided every gaze, shrinking as though he could melt into the wall. But no amount of shrinking could undo the reality that the world had seen them exposed. Amara, however, did not bask in the applause. She stood firm, her gaze fixed not on her accusers, but on the faces of the guests who now looked at her differently. No longer with pity, no longer with doubt, but with respect. A man in a sharp business suit stepped forward. "Ms. Johnson," he said quietly but firmly. "That was the most powerful thing I've ever witnessed in a place like this. You reminded all of us what true leadership looks like." Others nodded in agreement, their voices weaving together into murmurs of support. In that moment, the hotel lobby no longer felt like a stage of humiliation. It felt like a courtroom, and justice had been served. But beneath the applause, beneath the respect, a new current began to stir. The awareness that what happened here would not stay within these walls. The world outside was about to hear the story, and once it did, there would be no silencing it. By the time the dismissed staff stumbled out of the lobby, their eyes downcast and their futures crumbling, the incident had already begun to take on a life of its own. Several guests, who had quietly recorded the confrontation, now hovered in clusters, replaying the footage, whispering to each other in awe. The glow of phone screens lit up the corners of the room like tiny beacons. Fingers tapped furiously across screens, captions were typed, and within minutes, snippets of Amara's voice. "You mocked me. You denied me." Not because this hotel had no rooms, but because of who I am, spread across timelines and news feeds. The lobby, which only moments ago had been a sealed-off arena of humiliation and justice, was now the epicenter of a storm that would ripple outward into the world. By the next morning, the videos had already gathered thousands of views. Strangers who had never set foot inside the hotel watched in disbelief. Some praised Amara's strength, hailing her as a model of dignity and resilience. Others expressed outrage, condemning the staff's cruelty and asking how such open prejudice could still exist in an establishment of such stature. The hotel's name trended, not for luxury, but for scandal. Community leaders reached out. Journalists called for statements. Activists used the video as a rallying cry, proof that racism was not confined to history books or distant cities, but alive and festering in everyday spaces, even places meant to represent comfort and welcome. And through it all, one truth was undeniable. Amara had not only defended her dignity, she had forced an entire industry and society to confront its reflection in a mirror it could not turn away from. For the former staff members, the fallout was swift and merciless. Their names became synonymous with shame, their faces replayed on countless screens. Excuses no longer mattered. The world had already judged them, but for Amara, the ripple was different. People began to speak her name with reverence. Survivors of similar humiliation wrote to her, thanking her for standing tall when so many had been silenced. Her pain had become a spark, igniting conversations that stretched far beyond the marble walls of her hotel. The story was no longer hers alone. It had become a movement. When the lobby finally emptied, when the last guest's murmurs faded, and the weight of applause dissolved into silence, Amara retreated to her private suite upstairs. For the first time since the confrontation, she allowed herself to sit, to breathe, to feel the tremor that had been building beneath her calm exterior. The room was quiet. Yet her mind replayed the scene in vivid fragments. The smirk on the receptionist's face, the sting of being laughed at, the gasps when she revealed the truth. Each memory landed heavily, as though her heart was both bruised and burning at the same time. She pressed her palms together, staring at the dark window. Beyond the glass, the city glittered, lights blinking indifferently against the night sky. Out there, she knew, people were already dissecting her story. Some called her brave, others called her overreactive. The world has always had its judgments. But sitting alone, Amara thought not of headlines or applause. She thought of her grandmother, who once told her, "You will walk into rooms where they will not see you, but don't you ever forget who you are." Tonight, she had lived those words in the harshest way possible. And though she had emerged victorious, the victory tasted bittersweet. Power could dismiss a staff. Power could silence a lobby, but it could not erase the wound of being denied her humanity in the first place. A single tear escaped, sliding hot against her cheek, not of weakness but of release. She let it fall. Because beneath the armor of ownership and authority, she was still human. Still a woman who had walked into her own hotel and been told she didn't belong. Yet even in that pain, a quiet pride stirred. She had not bowed. She had not broken. And perhaps that was the truest victory. Not the firing, not the applause, but the refusal to shrink when the world tried to make her small. She wiped her cheek, straightened her back, and whispered to the empty room, "They will remember." The story of Amara's confrontation did not end in that lobby, nor even in the walls of her hotel. It lived on in conversations, in the endless scroll of social media, in dinner tables and office break rooms where people asked themselves uncomfortable questions. How many others had been humiliated in silence? How many times had someone been told no, not because of rules or policy, but because of the color of their skin, the accent in their voice, the clothing they wore? How many turned away quietly, carrying the sting with no one to witness it? Amara's act had been dramatic, yes, it had been powerful. But at its heart, it was not about one woman firing two employees. It was about the millions of unseen moments where dignity is denied, where prejudice hides behind polite smiles or rigid rules. Her decision to expose, to confront, to reverse the humiliation was a spark. But the fire it lit belonged to everyone watching. Racism is not only in the blatant insult or the cruel smirk, but it is also in the subtle glance that questions your presence. It is in the silence when your pain is ignored. It is in the comfortable denial that says, "Things like that don't happen anymore." Yet here it was, unfolding in broad daylight in a luxury hotel lobby. Proof that progress does not mean the end of prejudice. It only means the battles take new forms. The applause that night was not just for Amara. It was for every person who had swallowed their pride in silence, for every voice that had been choked down, for every story that never made it to a camera lens. Her act gave them a piece of justice, even if only for a moment. But justice should not come only when power exposes cruelty. Justice should live in policies, in training, in cultures that value humanity over bias. Until that happens, stories like Amara's will continue to repeat. As the video of her confrontation made its way around the world, people reacted with anger, with tears, with admiration. But perhaps the most critical reaction was the quiet pause, the moment when someone, somewhere, asked themselves, "Would I have stood up in that lobby? Or would I have watched in silence?" And that is the haunting truth her story leaves behind, that racism does not just survive in the actions of the cruel, it survives in the silence of the bystanders.